There's a sword sitting in a Japanese museum right now that experts value at over $100 million. A 14th century blade, forged from steel so fundamentally compromised that by every rule of material science it had no business becoming a weapon at all, let alone history's most valuable one. The iron source was wrong. The smelting process was inefficient. The raw material was, by any objective comparison, inferior to what European and Persian smiths were working with at the same time. The smiths knew all of this. They built the blade anyway, and the techniques they invented to compensate for everything that was wrong with their material ended up producing something no other sword tradition ever replicated. Japan is an island nation built on volcanic rock. It has almost no viable iron ore deposits in the conventional sense. What it does have, scattered across riverbeds and mountain slopes, is iron sand, called satetsu, fine magnetic particles that have to be painstakingly gathered, processed, and smelted before a smith can even begin thinking about a blade. To understand how significant this disadvantage was, consider what other cultures had access to. European smiths were working with high-grade iron ore they could mine in quantity and smelt into relatively consistent steel. Persian smiths had access to woots, a crucible steel with a carbon distribution that gave it properties Japanese smiths spent centuries trying to approximate through entirely different methods. Even the swords of the Korean peninsula were being made from more predictable raw material than what Japanese smiths were handed. The smelting process developed to deal with satetsu was called the tatara furnace. It was not a quick solution. A single tatara operation ran for 72 hours continuously. Charcoal had to be fed at precise intervals. Temperature had to be maintained by teams working in shifts around the clock. At the end of 3 days of uninterrupted labor, the furnace produced a bloom called tamahagane, raw, inconsistent, full of impurities and slag. A single tamahagane bloom could contain steel ranging from almost pure soft iron in some sections to near-brittle high-carbon steel in others. The carbon distribution across the bloom was wildly uneven. There was no way to predict which section would behave which way until you started working it. This was the starting point. This was the foundation every katana in history was built from. And the first problem the smith had to solve before anything else was making this chaotic, inconsistent material workable at all. The folding process is the most misunderstood technique in sword history. Popular culture treats it as a mark of quality. The more folds, the better. The legend of 1,000 folds somehow producing a superior blade. Skeptics correctly point out that folding steel too many times actually destroys its properties by evening out the carbon too aggressively. Both sides are arguing about the wrong thing. Folding existed for one reason. The tamahagane bloom was too impure and too inconsistent to use as it came out of the furnace. Slag pockets ran through the metal. Carbon distribution was random. If you tried to forge a blade directly from unworked tamahagane, the result would be unpredictable at best and catastrophically brittle at worst. The folding process, typically between 10 and 16 times in traditional practice, served to drive out the slag through repeated hammering and to redistribute the carbon more evenly across the billet through the heat cycling. Each fold doubled the layers and worked the impurities toward the surface where they could be knocked away. It was not artistry, it was damage control. European smiths working with cleaner ore did not fold repeatedly because they did not need to. Their steel came out of the smelting process in a state usable enough to work directly into a blade. The folding technique that became synonymous with Japanese swords, the technique that gets romanticized in every documentary about katana making, was invented because the starting material was so poor that it demanded intervention before anything else could happen. Once the billet was refined enough to work with, the smith faced a second problem, one that no amount of folding could solve. Hard steel holds an edge. Flexible steel survives impact. These properties sit at opposite ends of the same spectrum, and every sword tradition in history made a choice between them, accepting the trade-off that came with it. A sword optimized for edge retention would chip or snap under heavy lateral stress. A sword optimized for flexibility would deform and lose its edge under repeated use. You picked your poison. Japanese smiths found a way out of that trade-off. Not because they were philosophically committed to perfection, because the inconsistency of tamahagane forced them to develop control over the cooling process in ways that other traditions never needed to explore. The technique is differential hardening. Before the final quench, the smith applies a clay mixture to the blade, thick along the spine, thin, almost translucent along the cutting edge. The blade is then heated to critical temperature and plunged into water. The physics of what happens next are precise. The thin clay layer along the edge allows that section of the blade to cool almost instantaneously. When steel cools that fast from critical temperature, the carbon atoms do not have time to migrate and organize into softer structures. Instead, they lock into a crystalline lattice called martensite, extremely hard, capable of holding a razor edge through repeated cutting. The thick clay along the spine slows the cooling dramatically. The steel in that region transitions through different crystalline structures as it cools more slowly, ending up as perlite and ferrite, far tougher, far more resistant to the kind of lateral shock that would snap a fully hardened blade. The result is a single piece of steel with two fundamentally different internal structures. Modern metallurgical analysis has confirmed edge hardness reaching 830 to 850 HV on well-executed blades, comparable to advanced tool steels. Bending strength at the edge approaches 4,500 megapascals. The spine of the same blade sits in an entirely different range, built for resilience rather than hardness. The visible line where these two zones meet is the hamon, the flowing, cloud-like boundary that runs along the edge of every traditionally made Japanese blade. It is not a decoration. It is not an aesthetic choice. It is the physical record of where fast cooling ended and slow cooling began. It is a map of the internal structure of the steel, made visible. This technique exists because tamahagane was inconsistent enough that Japanese smiths had to develop extraordinary control over every variable in the process just to produce a reliable weapon. The clay hardening method, the hamon, the split internal structure that makes the katana both hard and flexible simultaneously, all of it was forced into existence by the inadequacy of the raw material. The kirihaba sadamune is a tachi forged in the Nanbokucho period, the 14th century, during one of the most technically advanced eras of Japanese swordmaking. It later passed into the hands of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the warlord who unified Japan. From Hideyoshi, it moved to his general Maeda Toshie. In 1697, it was absorbed into the Tokugawa shogunate collection. It now sits in the Tokyo National Museum, classified as an important cultural property. Art fund appraisals have placed its value above $100 million. Even conservative estimates put it among the most valuable swords ever assessed. And sword historians and metallurgists who have studied blades of this period are consistent on one point. The kirihaba sadamune is not worth that figure because it is a superior weapon. The steel is not harder than a blade worth a few $1,000s. The edge geometry is not more refined. The hamon is not functionally more effective. The value of that blade overwhelmingly derives from documented ownership by figures who shaped Japanese history. Hideyoshi's hands, Maeda's collection, the Tokugawa name, centuries of verified provenance attaching the object to events and people that defined an entire civilization. For comparison, the Yamato-rige, a 13th century national treasure tachi considered one of the finest surviving examples of its period, was purchased by Seituchi City in 2020 through a crowdfunding campaign for approximately $4.5 million. That blade had no comparably famous ownership chain. The craft was arguably superior. The price was a fraction. Japan's leading contemporary swordsmith, Yoshindo Yoshihara, works from the same tamahagane tradition. His blades take roughly 3 months each to complete. They start at approximately $60,000. There are only around 300 active swordsmiths remaining in Japan today, half as many as there were 40 years ago. The craft has never been more rare, more skilled, or more expensive to practice. And a blade from the finest living practitioner of that tradition is worth about $60,000. The kirihaba sadamune is worth 1,000 times that. Not because the craft improved, not because the steel is better, because history attached itself to the object. Every technique the katana is famous for was invented as a workaround. The tatara furnace existed because Japan had no better iron source. The folding process existed because tamahagane came out of the furnace too impure to use directly. The differential hardening and the hamon existed because the inconsistency of the material forced smiths to develop levels of process control that other traditions never needed. The blade that defined Japanese martial culture, the object that became a symbol of precision and mastery across the world, was built entirely from compensations. From solutions to problems that better resource sword traditions never had to solve. And the most expensive example of that tradition is expensive for reasons that have almost nothing to do with any of it. The steel is irrelevant to the price. The folding is irrelevant to the price. The hamon is irrelevant to the price. What matters is who owned it and what those people meant to history. The sword that shouldn't have existed, forced into being by bad iron, sustained by damage control techniques invented out of necessity, carrying the fingerprints of the men who built a nation, ended up becoming the most culturally irreplaceable blade ever made. Not despite its origins, because of them.